Welcome to E3, Engage and Empower with Empathy, a podcast brought to you by the Empathy Collective, a consulting firm that helps business leaders inspire change, one conversation at a time. We are building a community of like-minded leaders and experts who all share the same passion, taking care of people at work. Whether you are a blue-collar worker or white-collar worker, small business owner or corporate executive, you belong in this community. From studying the dead to finding talent in the living, my guest today, Dr. Olivia Hanninen, is a senior director at an executive search firm and a former historian. After obtaining a PhD in Russian history, she found her calling in the least likely of places, recruiting top talent for the most important function in human capital management, the Chief Human Resources Officer, or the CHRO. I will talk to Olivia about her transition from historian to recruiter, how the CHR role has evolved in the last 5 years, how HR is tied to value creation, and what CHROs are doing to address middle management burnout. This is E3, Engage and Empower with Empathy. Welcome to the show today, Olivia. It's so nice to have you here. Really looking forward to this conversation, particularly because you have a really interesting background, and we'll talk about that first. But you have a very unique lens into human resources and the evolution that's happened in the HR role over the last 5 years. And I found that incredibly fascinating. So very excited to dive into that.
Thank you very much for having me, Rebecca. Very excited to be here.
Cool. So yeah, let's talk about your cool background. I know when we had a few chats offline, I was surprised and super intrigued to hear that you spent some time in Russia. So how did that come about?
Yeah, I basically like to describe myself as a recovering academic. Age 20, I was pretty sure I was going to be a professor of Russian history. So I went and got my PhD in Russian history, spent a bunch of time in Russia doing my field work and in the archives, collecting all of these like very, very cool documents. What I realized through that process, though, that something 20-year-old me wasn't smart or introspective enough to appreciate is that I'm basically an extrovert. I really love being around people, specifically living people. And the problem with history, as intellectually stimulating though I found it and I continue to find it, is that everyone around you is dead. And even within academia, history is probably one of the lonelier subjects. I think a lot of scientists, for example, they work together in labs. You're very much kind of going solo as a historian. And that just kind of started to kind of wear me down to a point where I was like, hey, I don't think this is a real path to happiness for me. And so I pivoted about as hard as you can to being in executive recruitment, where I spend every minute of every day basically talking to either other people or my colleagues.
Clearly, you're craving the human connection so badly that you felt the need to make that very strong pivot. So how do you make such a strong transition? Like, what did that process look like for you?
It was, I think, a lot of dumb luck. People in executive search always joke nobody grows up thinking, oh man, I want to be a headhunter one day. It's an industry that everybody falls into sideways somehow. And so I was writing my dissertation. I was like a few months from finishing, and I was like, okay, I'm not going to be a professor. Like, I know that this isn't right for me. And what I did is I just went on LinkedIn and I looked for people with backgrounds like me who either had like PhDs in history or masters. And I reached out to them. So I was like, hey, what is your job? And can you explain it to me? And how did you make that transition? And I was going through this process, and I think I was kind of thinking, oh, maybe like management consultancy, that's going to be a good route because it's sort of the ultimate like jack of all trades, master of none route. And I was gearing up to sort of start applying and taking that seriously when ECA Partners, the company I've been with for the last 4 and a bit years, they reached out to me, said, hey, we'd love to interview you. We've got a PhD internship program we're rolling out. It was like, pretty local to me. So I thought, hey, this could be like a scam or something, but it also could be great interview practice. Let's go and see what it's about. And I was just blown away by everybody I met at ECA, just the smartest colleagues I could possibly hope for, but they were also outgoing extroverts. And so it was ticking that box for me. And so I just kept saying like yes to the next round. And it was a great decision. And something I've learned from talking to all of these wonderful people with fantastic careers in recruitment is a common thread is people with successful careers, I should say, often follow great people. They're often like, oh, I didn't go to the company because I was obsessed with the product. They were like, I interviewed with this person and I wanted to learn from them. And I think without really knowing it, that's kind of how I approached ECA, and no regrets.
I love that. And I think that just emphasizes the importance of the human component of business. Because, yeah, you've made me think about all the interviewing processes I've gone through and my motive for being interested. And it always starts with the person. Like, it sounds like ECA basically hired a bunch of recovering PhDs.
Yeah.
And I love that they had a PhD internship program. How does a recruiting, because I've never heard of this in a recruiting firm, how does a recruiting firm just decide we need to have a PhD internship program because those are the people who should be headhunters? How does that come about?
Yeah. So our founder, Atta, he's fantastic. I had the same question in my interview. I was like, how did you guys come up with this? And I was actually the first PhD intern. So I was kind of a bit of a guinea pig, but there were a couple of people before me who just kind of gone straight in without even like the internship to sort of soften the blow. So, but I asked Atta this question and he said, well, most of my friends growing up went into academia. And he grew up in Sweden, so a little bit of a different culture. But he just, I think, had always been very dialed in through his friendship groups to how smart a lot of these people are and how, frankly, frustrated some people get. I think not just with like the lack of human connection like me, but also academia is famously quite slow in terms of its pace. And so you do get people who just aren't the best fit. Who find themselves in academia. And so he thought, hey, what a great candidate pool, to use the lingo, to go after as I expand out my own company. And we've seen a ton of success. Our first PhD hire is now co-CEO of ECA's sister company that spun out a few years ago. We've got PhDs up in our like managing director positions. It's been great, and we make a really good trivia team when we do go out for happy hours.
I bet you do. Because I'm sure you have expertise in such a variety of fields.
I didn't mention this when we first chatted, and I regretted not doing so at the time, but it's mostly difference, right, between academia and executive search, but there are some crossovers. So I was really into like the history of ideas as a historian, and empathy was one of those like very hot trending things to study from a historical perspective right when I was going through my PhD program. So the fact that you're taking this lens in this kind of professional environment is really interesting to me, and it actually makes me feel like I'm not so far from home than I sometimes do.
Well, that's wonderful. Yeah, you did not mention that to me, and I didn't realize that context. I actually just finished reading a book. Since you're a historian, maybe, well, you're probably very familiar with Doris Kearns Goodwin. She's also a historian.
Mm-hmm.
But I read her book, Leadership in Turbulent Times, and she basically covers different presidents throughout US history. And the common thread for those presidents is empathy. And how they exercise empathy in their leadership approach while also getting stuff done. So I found it incredibly interesting that, dating back to Abraham Lincoln and going through the Civil War all the way to the Civil Rights era, regardless of time frame, empathy was still kind of that core foundational element that helped drive these leaders' success. So anyway, that was just an aside on empathy and history. But let's talk a little bit about the present day and what we've seen in the world of human resources. So you started at the executive recruiting agency, and you kind of naturally found your sweet spot in human resources and recruiting for the chief human resources officer role, or the CHRO. Talk a little bit about how you made that transition into that specialization in recruitment. Why did you fall in love with it? And then also, how has this role evolved? Even in the last 5 years, I think there's been a lot of changes. I'm sure you've seen a lot.
Yeah, no, great questions. I think there was sort of a couple of things that made me move towards specializing in human resources, human capital. The first is there was kind of opportunity at ECA. We'd always done HR roles, here, that we were sort of reacting to a client coming back to us. They'd say, hey, we love the CFO that you placed with us. Do you do CHROs? And we go, yeah, sure. And then we'd go and we'd do a good job. But it wasn't something that we were kind of going to market with as one of our core strengths. So there was this sort of natural space that we had expertise in, but we maybe weren't kind of utilizing as much as we could internally. For me personally, and I always laugh to myself as I say this because it sounds like such a stretch, but it is one of those, I think, parallels from my academic past through to my present day, where my research, I was, like I said, a historian of Russia prior to the revolution. And my question was, how did people feel about dying for their country? It was a very dark topic. How did people feel about dying for their country in the Russo-Japanese War and the First World War at a time when like what this country meant on the brink of revolution was like very hard to define? And so it was a real combination of looking at kind of cultural texts and reading them for emotion essentially, and then looking at actual hard evidence and saying, okay, well, who was repatriated? Who got to go home to home soil, essentially? And I've always felt HR professionals are answering this question. Why should people want to work at this company versus another? And it's a similar combination of intuition, essentially, and then actionable data. I think the best HR professional is never going to just rely on pure numbers. I do always think there's an ability to read the room, essentially. And it's that combination of skill sets that I just have so much respect for. The ability to marry those two soft skills and hard skills into your impact has, like I said, I have so much respect for like what like a CFO can do, but because that's not something I'm very good at, I guess I don't necessarily.
I can relate.
I know how to connect to. Whereas when I'm talking to these CHROs about the problems that they're facing and their solutions they're coming up with, that is just, I lose track of time and I'm so invested in these conversations. And I always do think if you can follow what makes you incredibly captivated, you're probably going to enjoy your working day. So those were like my two drivers towards putting my hand up and going to my CEO and saying, like, hey, I want to really build out this human capital practice. And he said, yeah, go for it. Great idea. I joined ECA in 2020, I think, maybe 2021. It was peak COVID. It was that time when everybody had lost track of time. And I do think it was a good time to build out a CHRO practice because there's this incredible spotlight, I think, on CHROs in the last 4 to 5 years. And maybe that's always been the case and I'm biased because this is my own viewpoint. But the way I see it, there's kind of 3 prongs to that. The first is like external immediate pressures. In those last 4 to 5 years, you've had COVID, everyone had to go remote. And who was responsible for that? It was HR. You then have George Floyd, the BLM protests really shining a spotlight on inclusivity and diversity, putting a lot of pressure on CHROs to demonstrate that this is something that they care about in a way that isn't just window dressing. You then have that great resignation, which is HR scrambling to retain their workforce. You then have that return to office post-COVID. And now you've got the new administration with a new set of DEI commands, or however you want to phrase it. And I do think this has added up to the CHRO having a lot of attention on that seat. And I do think probably an appreciation of the difference between a best-in-class CHRO and a good CHRO. I think, those differences become really obvious. I think the second prong, which is not just in my exposure to this space, has been a far more drawn out, is these generational shifts. There's a lot of really smart people out there who've written great things about how Gen Z value different things to like millennials and boomers and these other generations. There's a lot of things thrown around like, oh, they're more concerned with work-life balance, different attitudes to work, and kind of how long you should be expected to give your loyalty to an employer and what loyalty even means. So again, I think that wonderful question that fascinates me about the space, why should someone want to work at my company versus another? Especially when it just doesn't boil down to money, that's put a spotlight on the CHRO as well. And then the third prong, which is something I see especially at ECA, because we work mostly with private equity. This is a space that's become tougher in recent years. Like there's more players in the space. Interest rates went up a few years ago. It's kind of no longer the case that a PE firm can buy a company and then hold it, do some financial wizardry, and sell for a profit in 5 years' time. There needs to be a lot more work now going into value creation. And I think those past few points have proved that the CHRO seat can be a real driver of something that moves the needle there.
That's fascinating because I think about being in the workforce pre-COVID, my perception of HR. And once again, this may have been just because of where I sat in the organization. Kind of like you said, it's like you feel like the CHR role has received more visibility, but maybe it's just from where you sit and just your perception. I don't think so. I think you're right. But, pre-COVID, my perception was, oh yeah, HR is like the behind the scenes, handles the paperwork, employees benefits packages, maybe organizes employee picnics, that kind of thing. That was like the HR role. But now it seems so much more strategic. And to your point about having to have that strong balance between tying HR impact to actual financial performance and the numbers, to being able to tune into intuition and really make decisions based on feeling the room. That's a really unique skill set and that not everyone can balance. So I just wonder so when you recruit for this role, how do you know you have the ideal candidate that can act as almost like a chameleon? I mean, when you just talked us through this whole evolution that HR had to go through in the last 5 years, from remote work, dealing with the pandemic, return to office, great resignation, the up of DEI and then the down of DEI. Like how can any one person take that on and do it successfully? It seems like almost impossible.
That's a very good question. How I handle that is I interrogate my clients extensively before we get to work. So I narrow down that list. We do a ton of work up front to say, okay, and no, for all of these, we've been talking in, I think, like generalizations thus far, but I think every company is going to have a very specific set of prioritizations for their HR leader, thankfully, for my job. So it really is drilling into that, and it depends on the company size, it depends on the industry. You get some industries with really tight talent pools, and so in that case, it's going to be someone who's really good at building out a world-class recruiting pipeline, and then also knows how to, tweak compensation and benefits to make it an attractive place to stay. Like that's kind of one example. Another one might be, you're coming into a company with a lot of executive leadership turnover, and so there is kind of more need from a cultural perspective to be reassuring and steady the boat and whatnot. If you've got a company gearing up for IPO, that's a very different set of HR skills as well. So luckily there is always like a winnowing down of, okay, what does success look like in this role in the first year, first 3 months, 6 months, whatever the timeline is there. From that, you kind of work up to your set of interview questions. But I do always think when you're interviewing someone, that combination of soft and hard skills are going to come through in those answers one way or another. And for me, that is normally what makes the excellent candidates stand out. The A pluses versus the A's is, the people who they have a plan, they have a playbook, but they can sense when they're going to have to divert, get creative, and then have the results to sort of demonstrate that was the right thing to do after the fact.
Well, and it also seems like change management and being able to handle constant change, because what you just recited to me over the last 5 years of just the constant ups and downs and changes that the CHRO would have to adapt to based on the current macroeconomic or geopolitical situation. Is that typically a focus with recruiting too? I mean, are you seeing that as a dynamic of how adaptable are you? How well can you drive change in an organization and manage disruption and uncertainty?
Yeah, I think 100%. It's all very well to roll out a new compensation plan, but if you can't get the managers of every single, group and business unit on board with why that's happening, and because they're the ones who are going to be communicating it down to the people that report into them, it can be the most genius compensation plan in the world, but without winning people over to it, it's not going to have the impact it could have. One of the big things I just realized I missed off in our grand roller coaster ride of HR is AI, which is, of course, the big thing of the last 6 months, year. And I'm hearing that a lot now from HR professionals who are saying AI is change management, essentially. We're changing how people do things, and that's that's always going to involve HR. I feel like I'm having that conversation day in, day out at the moment, specifically in regards to AI. But no, I agree completely. There's got to be that change management skill set in there.
We could probably have an entirely separate episode on AI and the impact of AI on HR. I've talked to some people who have seen in the HR department itself where certain administrative functions are being replaced by AI. How is HR upskilling or reskilling so that it does indeed evolve to become this more strategic role? It moves away from the administrative aspect of the role that AI can easily take advantage of. On the other hand, and I'd love to get your perspective on this, I attended a webinar recently where the speaker was talking about how AI is impacting recruiting. And, HR is obviously using AI in the recruiting process. And in many cases, people don't actually get to a real person in the initial screening stages. And AI is scanning resumes as well. So you could argue that from an inclusion perspective, that you're automatically weeding out people who could potentially be good candidates because AI is doing that initial work that maybe having that human connection could uncover a different result in the screening process. So it's a little bit controversial, in my opinion. I see where that makes HR more efficient, but at the same time, are we also excluding people, like good candidates in the recruiting process, by kind of automating that front end of the screening and just automatically, essentially throwing resumes in the virtual trash can without having that human element involved?
Yeah. This is when I miss academia because I'm like, okay, that is some really important research. Right now, I'm sure that there is some terrifying data out there about how AI screening is benefiting certain population pools and not benefiting others. I think about the future of executive search, I guess, though, and this because I think there are so many pitfalls to be had if you're just using AI instead of people, especially if you're talking of like a C-suite role. I work predominantly in our HR practice, but I also do some work in our go-to-market area. If I'm looking for a chief revenue officer or a chief sales officer, and I know from the CEO and the PE firm that they really want someone low ego, we're looking at LinkedIn profiles and we're reading how they're describing themselves. And it's not a perfect, correlation by any means, but I'm pulling out people who are, you can just tell from how they've written about themselves, there's a greater chance they're going to be a low ego chief revenue officer. I don't trust AI to be able to do that like now or anytime in the near future. I was actually at a conference a few weeks ago, for basically kind of executive search and private equity. And everyone's talking about AI, and there's a lot of, frankly, like hot air out there that you're like, oh, that's kind of interesting, but like, there's not like a so what, or like, what can I actually do about that? Which I do think is a lot of the conversation right now. My one tangible takeaway from that conference was someone said, if your executive search firm isn't asking you, how has this role changed because of AI in the last 6 to 12 months, they're not doing their job very well. And I was like, okay, that's awesome. I'm stealing that. Thank you. And so I think that's a lot of also what HR is doing right now is there's the tactical side, which is like, okay, can we use AI to help with our benefits? Like probably, but it's also literally looking at the entire organization and mapping out roles differently. I think that's the very strategic side of all of this, like where that question comes in. So yeah, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah. That's for another day to have another episode on that topic. But yeah, you were talking about chief revenue officer, chief sales officer. So kind of going back to the numbers conversation, because I think HR is, you kind of get this name of, oh, it's just the fluffy stuff. And so you even told me yourself that you are seeing a lot of influence from private equity on the value creation side of human resources, and investors really want to see how that output of the HR function ties to financial metrics like EBITDA. So how is HR demonstrating that value creation? And do you think that is the best way to measure impact of HR on the company's performance?
Very good question. Yeah. And that's something I'm always probing for in interviews as well. I think a lot of HR leaders now say like, hey, I'm a business person first and an HR leader second. You've also seen a trend of people not coming simply up through HR. I have folks in my network who were like CFOs or general consuls or came up through operations and strategy and then moved into HR. You also have fantastic people who've gone through, the more classic HR route. But what most of my clients are wanting to see when I present candidates is some sort of example of here's how this person has actually moved the needle, and can tie what they've done to EBITDA, either from like cost savings or even adding to the bottom line. Some of them are really obvious. So there's retention rates, for example. Onboarding people costs money. And if you're doing that more than you should be, you are wasting money. And the better someone is at retention, the more money you save. So there's some really obvious ones that I think aren't particularly complicated. So the example I used earlier about, if you're an expert at building a world-class talent pipeline and you're working with veterinary technicians where there just are not enough of them in the country, that value is going to shine through because you need to have people on your payroll to grow or to, beat the local competition. That's a real no-brainer, and I think it's very easy to see the numbers there. Where it gets more complicated and more into that like combination of some hard data and some softer skills is creating that environment where people want to put their best foot forward at work, a place people want to work, not just want to work, but want to work well. And I really like when people describe putting structures in place that come down to like transparency, for example. So I talk to CROs all the time. They're like, hey, I came to this company and I rolled out a new compensation and leveling plan. To return to an earlier point, they put in the work with the managers to make sure they knew how to communicate that down to their teams. And then you can just imagine the impact on a working environment of knowing, okay, here's what I need to do to get promoted versus it being like a completely opaque system where you never know how that works. Like, in what scenario are people going to be more willing to go the extra mile? It's going to be the one with clarity and transparency and fairness. And I think, it's not just saying, oh, HR sets that alone. I think you need like a C-suite that values HR and is empowering them to do that. But that is, again, like what a great HR leader can do. And I think if everybody is then like 10% more productive, you're going to see a massive difference in the overall effect of the company and the performance of the company. And it's not a silver bullet. You can you think about the number of companies that COVID hit. And if you're an in-person company, what could you do about that? It's never going to be a completely safe answer to any business problem.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I also want to talk about the pressure that HR seems to have on being responsible for everything. And I also heard this in another webinar that was geared towards HR professionals. And the speaker was saying, how many of you, raise your hand if how many have heard, oh yeah, HR will take care of that. Or, oh yeah, HR is responsible for that. Like fill in the blank, whatever issue it is. And so, yes, to a certain extent, HR is the driving force for the benefits package and enabling the executives and the people managers. But to a certain extent, the responsibility also lies on the people and especially the people leaders. And I'd love to talk to you a little bit, just kind of pivoting about the burnout that we're seeing in middle management. Because you could easily say, that's HR's responsibility, benefits package isn't good enough. We need to beef that up or whatever, like HR needs to fix this. Is it really HR, or is it something that we need to address with people managers themselves? How can we create more balance for them? How can we ensure that they have the right leadership development training so that they're not burning out their staff? I feel like there's something more than just, let's make a better benefits package. That feels to me kind of like a little Band-Aid that might temporarily cover what the real problem actually is. What is your take on that?
Yeah. It's a great question, and I don't know if I have any coherent answers. I've got a few thoughts that I can share. I think, first of all, on like this, is HR responsible for everything? I do think you see certain traits of successful HR leaders that a lot of them have in common, and one of them is you actually need I think a decently thick skin, and you can't be like the world's nicest, most empathetic person as an HR leader because that you cannot take on the burden of everybody in the company. That is not ultimately a recipe for success. So I think you do see with HR leaders, to use the cool term that kids use nowadays, you have to really have boundaries about what HR can and can't do just for it to be a workable function that isn't always doomed to failure. And I think seeing how those boundaries are erected is another one of those very mysterious fine arts of HR that I just could talk about endlessly. I think with middle management and how HR can kind of help with burnout there. My first take is some of the band-aids are really effective. And like, let's be honest, if you've cut yourself, you really need a band-aid. Like sometimes there's a time and a place for them. I have great conversations with people getting incredibly creative with like benefits offerings, for example, that really reflect their ideal employee pool. I think it's much more of than a band-aid to say, oh, companies are moving increasingly towards offering fertility treatments being covered by the health insurance. If you're a woman choosing to have kids later than like your parents did, which is definitely the case for me, like that's more than a band-aid. Like that's really meaningful. And I think there's like very, very positive things happening in this space. That said, I think it pebbles against a stream in some cases. I know that we talked earlier about, what COVID changed and didn't change, or what we learned from COVID and, ultimately maybe didn't learn well enough. As we're trying to reset the clock and just go back to what it was like before. Some of these problems are in, I don't know how you go about solving them. People who are often at mid-management stage, they've got kids to take care of on the one side and elderly parents to take care of on the other side. The costs of both have just been going up and up and up over the last few years. There's part of me that thinks, I don't know if companies can solve these problems. I think these are like government, maybe even like international level problems. So how can you push back against that? But I think to the extent that you can, it is probably coming back to how you approach things with this kind of empathy and trying to be flexible and trying not to say, okay, everybody has to return to office by X date. It's a blanket rule. We don't care about any exceptions. Like that's easy and it's enforceable, but is it going to lead to greater problems down the road by encouraging burnout? Like probably. And then you're going to have an even bigger problem to fix.
Yeah. No, it's interesting because I was just talking to someone in middle management the other day, and she was saying how there was a return to office policy that was implemented from the top down. And she said that's, it's a battle I'm not willing to fight at the moment with my employees, because during COVID, many of them went permanently remote and even moved further away from the office. So she basically told me, I'm not mandating it, because to me, it's just going to create more stress in my team, decrease productivity, and maybe even turnover. So she picks her battles, but it's like that's the role of the middle manager, trying to decide, okay, which rules do I follow here and which ones do I just kind of let slide, because in the end, it's going to impact employee well-being and even turnover possibly.
Yeah, I had this great conversation with a CHRO maybe like a year ago now. It was when return to office was kind of peaking, and I think some of the bigger famous companies were doing it. But this gentleman worked for a lower mid-market PE-backed company, and the CEO, he was brought in, and after a couple of months, the CEO was like, right, we're going to do a return to office. Similar situation, the workforce had dispersed. They'd said, we're not going to do return to office for a really long time. And then the CEO wanted to completely do an about time. And the way that the CHRO handled it was he said, okay, let's think this through. How are you going to enforce this, first of all? Are we going to be putting in like card swipey things again? He was like, walk me through the logistics. How do you see this happen? And then he's like, and then what is the punishment going to be for people not doing this? What's your plan there? And he kind of broke down every single logistical step where it's like, look, if you're going to put your neck on the line and make everyone return to office, you're probably going to have to follow through on that. Otherwise, it's going to be a complete waste of time. And then he also made a spreadsheet of the costs associated with each one of those practical steps.
That's smart.
Relatively quickly, the CEO was like, you know what? Maybe we'll just sort of give it a few months more of remote or hybrid and see how things go. And I was like, that was a really great answer, I thought.
Well, I love that approach. Yeah, because the HR leader was really bringing concrete, asking good questions.
Yeah.
To reveal, the thought process behind it.
Good questions, money, making it about the bottom line, and then just saying, okay, like with the data, do you still back this decision? I'll do it if you want me to, but really think about this, please.
But change management will be hard. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And costly. Yeah.
And costly. And again, it's like, I mean, like, yeah, are you really going to go back to swiping in and out for your lunch break?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we're in a different world now. Well, honestly, Olivia, this has been such an interesting dialogue. I really enjoyed talking through all the nuances of HR. I feel like I learned a lot about what HR does today. So thank you for enlightening me. And yeah, I appreciate you taking the time today and having this conversation.
I had a blast. Thank you so much for having me.
If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe wherever you like to listen to podcasts. And if you would like to learn more about the Empathy Collective, check out our website, theempathycollective.com. Life is too short. Let's take care of each other at work so that together we can make this world a better place.